Hi there. My name is Donna Lyon. I am an academic and a researcher at the Faculty of Fine Arts and Music, University of Melbourne, Australia. I'm also a survivor of ritual abuse. Today, I feel privileged to hold the space and be the facilitator of this session, which is the first of a two-part series, The Interface Between Sex Trafficking, Ritual Abuse, and Mind Control Programming. In Australia, we start gatherings, meetings, and events with an acknowledgement of country. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future, and acknowledge any Indigenous listeners we have here today. Today, we have 3 child sex trafficking survivors who will be sharing their personal experiences of ritual abuse, mind control, and sex trafficking. Their intention is to raise awareness of these crimes among sex trafficking survivors and to illustrate how ritual abuse and mind control programming are used to control victims. Their stories represent a snapshot of thousands of others of survivors' experiences across our globe. In part 1, our survivors will share about their childhood and how mind control and ritual abuse intersect with sex trafficking, child pornography, and as victims of pedophilia. In part 2, our survivors will turn to how they got out, how their abusers attempted to maintain control, signs and symptoms specific to their mind control and ritual abuse, and share their recovery and healing. Part 1 can be heavy and intense, but please know that every time a survivor of this kind of abuse tells their story, they break the programming and silencing they were threatened with by the cults and abusers who hurt them. Sharing the truth means sharing the burden, and it also means we are beginning to accept the discomfort, horror, and atrocities that people are capable of and that are part of our lives and histories. Please feel free to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Our panelists understand and support you in your self-care. Today, our panel includes Jean Riseman, a retired social worker, active volunteer and ritual abuse, mind control peer activist and community organiser. Mary Bolger, artist, poet, publisher and survivor activist. And Anneke Lucas. Anneke is an author, speaker, advocate for child sex trafficking victims and creator of the unconditional model, a mindfulness modality. We will begin with Jean Riseman. Welcome, Jean. Please unmute and start when you are ready.
Thank you, Donna. I was born in 1937, which makes me 85. Things were a bit different then. Technology was simpler and child sex trafficking was not as organized, perhaps not as lucrative. Mind control programming has also become much more sophisticated over the last 80 years. Still, what children are going through today is not all that different from what I went through all those many years ago. Constant pain, constant terror, constant lies, and sadism. I was ritually abused in a Satanic cult, enrolled in a research project and mind control experiment, and used in child pornography. All these things happened at the same time. What tied them together was my family. My folks were wealthy and lived mainly off of inherited money. I don't know how the money was originally made. Social standing was very important, though, to them, and it was assumed that I would be a debutante and have a lavish coming out party. I was sent to private schools. Many of my clothes were made to order, and I grew up among nannies, governesses, maids, and cooks. The one thing I didn't have was emotional contact with my parents. My mother felt like a babysitter to me, as she only spent time with me when my caretaker had her weekly day off. She was clueless when it came to raising children and turned to people she considered to be experts whenever a question arose. I felt like a doll to her. I had very little contact with my father until I was 10, after he was discharged from the army at the end of World War II. When I was a toddler, if he came into a room, he would get up and leave. I think he was afraid he would hurt me, which unfortunately he did. After I was 10, he spent a good deal of time with me, though, reading poetry to me, correcting my English assignments, trying to teach me what he knew about finance. I liked the attention, but I didn't appreciate being criticized and bossed around. I also did not appreciate the way he kissed me and clung tightly to me. My mother, as usual, noticed nothing. Sorry. I got glimpses of other ways of life through books, and then as a teen through my classmates' families. Also in my teens, I discovered Freud and Marx and started rejecting my family's values. I felt ashamed of having money. I knew there was more to life, and I was hungry for it. I had no idea there was so much more under the surface, and I did not start to figure it out until midlife, after both my parents had died. They never had a chance to break through their amnesia and heal. That's sad, but not surprising. In those days, hardly anybody was aware of child abuse, while today we can learn about dissociation, childhood trauma, ritual abuse, and other forms of extreme abuse. There are even safe spaces to talk about these things. You feel so blessed by that. Ritual abuse was the first thing that came to my consciousness. It erupted in a terrifying series of flashbacks that lasted for a couple of years nonstop. I did not think I could live through it. I feared my heart would stop from the terror. But suddenly some things made sense. Why I had always felt so guilty, why I always assumed I was bad, defective, dirty, evil. There was a tiny little silver lining, though. There really was a cause for all my problems. I'll tell you just a few of the things that happened in that cult. Training was geared toward unthinking obedience and to make me believe I was evil and that I belonged with them and to them. I was placed in double binds where I was given the choice of two horrible things. No matter how I tried to avoid making a choice, I was always tricked or forced to harm an animal or a person. They told me I had made the wrong choice and it was my fault, proving once again that I was evil through and through. The threats were horrific. I was told that if I didn't obey, I would have my eyes poked out and that my arms and legs would be shot off one at a time. I would be left a helpless torso to be carried around in a wagon. There was a birth ritual that I was subjected to when I was 4. I was put naked inside a deer that had been shot and gutted, with my feet in its rib cage. The loose skin was sewn up around me, and there was much chanting. Finally, the skin near my head was ripped open, and I was pulled out. I was supposedly born into Satanism and would remain a Satanist to my death and beyond. Wrong. It didn't happen. Once they made me believe that I was having a baby, my firstborn, my first experience of childhood, and I was only 4. They gave me something that induced stomach cramps, and I was laid on a table. They sprayed me from below with water and told me that my waters had broken. A rat was then released from between my legs. It was supposed to be caught by the attendants and then sacrificed to Satan. But it was wet and slippery and got away. I screamed inside silently, "Run, rat, run, 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 run." He got away, my firstborn beloved. There are still things about my life that I do not know, and I doubt if I ever will know. I do know my mind was shattered by electroshock when I was 2, but I do not know who did it or why it was done. My mind splintered into tiny pieces like grains of sand. This resulted in an enduring sense that there's no me inside, that I have no name, no coherent parts that could be called altered personalities, just that those little grains of sand, those fragments. I have come to understand that tiny parts of me form a group to do something, and that group is not stable. Whenever I wash dishes or drive a car, a whole different group of fragments is in charge. I sometimes talk to the fragments. We are going to stop at every red light and every stop sign. We will use the turn signal every time we want to change lanes or make a turn. They never answer. Once, excuse me, once in therapy I said, I'm going to pretend I'm a multiple and draw my system. What came pouring out was what I had learned as a research subject in a mind control experiment that my father had arranged for me to participate in from the age of 6 to 12. It took place in an academic setting, but was funded by an outside organization, perhaps a branch of the military. There were 2 parts to the project. One explored whether it was possible to program children without using torture, threats, or deceit, just with hypnosis and the usual ways children learn, by memorizing, by practicing, by listening to a teacher. It is possible. The other part focused on designing internal mental structures that could be used to hold information, give commands, and learn what had occurred during the assignment. Since I did not have a loving bond with my father, I really connected with my teacher, the man who was conducting the research. Participating in the experiments was a bright spot in an otherwise alternatively boring, confusing, disgusting, or terrifying world. I enjoyed the challenges of learning this complicated stuff and felt appreciated and cared for by the nicest man I had ever met. It never crossed my mind he could have been exploiting me. I see traces of his looks and personality in men that I have been attracted to over the years. I want to be clear that this research was not continued and that it left no trace in modern mind control methods. I've met a couple of thousand survivors easily, and have never heard anybody speak of being programmed without being tortured, often to the point of near-death experiences. The project ended in 1949 when he suddenly lost his funding. I was bereft. Many years later, it was exhilarating to uncover elegant structures in my mind that had been shut down and remained dormant for all those years. But it was very sad to realize that they would have been used to train children to grow up and be used for evil purposes. Dark ops, spies, couriers, assassins, sex slaves, used to please some people and blackmail others. As to the sex trafficking, I always knew, in the sense that I was aware of symptoms that I knew were not normal. After I entered therapy, I slowly put 2 and 2 together and was able to say that I had been used in child pornography. It's the hardest area for me to explore, and I still have lots of work before me. My father knew some people through the cult who were engaged in child pornography. I was pimped out to them. A cut of my earnings went to my father, the rest to the cult. And that's why I think money is dirty, and I wish I didn't have any. Children were made to perform in live sex shows on stage for groups of men. Usually it was sex between the children, but sometimes adult men had sex with us on stage, acting in stories that involved S&M scenes. Sometimes I was taken home by a man after the main show. The porn ring also made movies. We're talking about the 40s and early 50s. So the films were mostly black and white. Color was very expensive in those days. The movies were sold to wealthy men, and still shots, which of course cost less, were collected by less well-off people. I know that there are movies and stills from that era. They're called classic and vintage, and they're on the dark web. It gives me chills to think that there may still be images of me in circulation. The don't tell, don't remember commandment laid down by the cult was strongly reinforced to protect those who produce the sex shows and their customers. To this day, I have trouble remembering names and faces. I find it very hard to talk about. It feels dangerous to be here today, being filmed, speaking out about this part of my childhood, frightening and shameful. I know it is not dangerous to me today. I know that these are feelings from the past, but they're still strong. I know that there are a subset of children who are being trafficked, who have a background of ritual abuse and or mind control. I do not know the percentage. Hopefully, as aware of these connections grows, we will have an answer to that question. And more importantly, you all will be able to recognize these children, protect them from being accessed and returned to a life of exploitation and degradation, and find truly effective ways to deal with their fear, shame, and guilt. I hope that what we are sharing today will be helpful to you. And I hope you will come join us for part 2, where you will hear about happier experiences, escaping and learning to live in freedom, building self-respect, even self-love, and to find purpose and pleasure in life. Thank you. Thank you for bearing witness to what I lived through.
Thank you so much, Jean. Next, I'd like to introduce Mary. Mary, when you're ready, thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Donna. This presentation has artwork I created to help me navigate the intense flashbacks I've been having to abuse in my childhood. The art is often very graphic because it is the truth of what I was experiencing as a child. I will show this slide before the art to help you prepare for it. My story is about child sex trafficking, mind control programs, ritual abuse, and my experiences as a survivor of them. It is also a story about the power and strength of the human spirit and the power of love to heal the deepest of wounds. I was brought into child sex trafficking by my father and what I believe is a criminal faction of the United States government. Both my parents were Irish immigrants to the United States who met and married in New York City during the early 1960s. I was their firstborn child. Before he met my mom, my father served in the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army. A veteran once told me that the 101st Airborne Division is considered to be special forces and is a highly trained and tested part of the Army. At some point, my father left the service and became a businessman. He and his partner soon owned 3 bars in the New York City area. It was during this time that my father met and married my mother, and I was born. My father started sexually abusing me at a young age, about 2 years old. I was later told by my mom that when I was around the age of 4, my father started taking me to work with him a lot. My father was a workaholic and an alcoholic. He often came home drunk and abusive after working 12 to 14 hours at his bars. I know now my father was not taking me to work with him. My father was taking me to many different locations where I was being used by groups of people, mostly men, for sex, pornography, blackmail, mind control programming, and ritual abuse. Some of these places were lab-like and very clinical. Here, I was often strapped to a chair. Or an examination table, and hurt very badly, physically, mentally, and emotionally, by men in white lab coats and military uniform. They used electricity, drugs, verbal and sexual abuse, and pain to torture me. I was terrified and would become overwhelmed with pain and fear, and would often float away and disconnect from my body and emotions. I have been told this is called dissociation. I believe this was purposefully done by my abusers so they could access my subconscious mind to manipulate and control it. They created separate and distinct parts within me that they could call out and use at will. These parts were trained and programmed using fear, pain, affection, drugs, and phrases repeated over and over and over again. I was programmed to be mindlessly obedient and quiet, and to please men sexually. They also created parts in me that held rage, and there was at least one part being trained to kill. Other parts were programmed to commit suicide. Bizarrely, I even had a part of me trained to act like a puppy dog. My abusers seemed to get a big kick out of this. These men were attempting to destroy my sense of worth and program me to feel that obeying and serving my abusers was a great honor. I believe quite a few of these men were Project Paperclip scientists. Project Paperclip was a then secret US intelligence program that brought over 1,500 German scientists and engineers to the United States after World War II. Many of these scientists and engineers were ardent Nazis and war criminals. Some of the scientists abusing me used German words and phrases and were very enamored with Nazi ideology. There were times I saw banners on a wall, a pin on a lapel, a ring, or an armband with a swastika or other Nazi symbols on it. I have since learned that Hitler was intent on world domination and was fascinated by the idea of using mind sciences to control the masses. During World War II, German scientists were given free rein to do oftentimes cruel and inhumane medical and mind control experiments on concentration camp prisoners. I saw many other children at the lab-like and clinical places I was brought to. Some were considered expendable. And were beaten and killed in front of me. And other children to train us to be obedient and frighten us into silence. I saw many children kept in cages, and at times I was as well. I was also brought to places where groups of people, mostly men, were abusing children in occult settings. These were occult rituals where having sex with a child or inflicting pain upon a child was considered a powerful offering to the entity they worshiped. This was done to me, and I witnessed it being done to other children as well. Some of these groups also killed adults, children, and or animals as part of their occult rituals. They also practiced a kind of sacramental cannibalism. I was also brought to places that appeared opulent and wealthy. I and other children were considered to be sexual playthings for the pedophiles there. As a small child, I was forced into a very large and highly organized child sex trafficking network where I and countless other children were put through brutal mind control programming so we could be easily manipulated. I feel we were then being farmed out to pedophiles, pornographers, and occult groups as sexual slaves. I escaped this murderous network at the age of 10. In part 2 of our presentation, I will share some of the signs and symptoms of mind control and ritual abuse I have exhibited throughout my life. I will also share my journey of escape, freedom, and healing. Thank you for listening. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Next, our third speaker for part 1 is Anneke Lucas. Anneke, welcome, and please start when you're ready.
Thank you, Donna. And thank you, Mary. And thank you, Jean, for sharing. And I want to thank the audience that is with us, that are listening to us. We understand that this is very difficult to absorb. I was born in Belgium in 1963. My mother was single, and which was unusual at the time. And she was also mentally ill. And she married at age 3. And when I was 6 years old, she ended up connecting with what was the local group of the pedophile network that was really the national group, which I called a club always, where my mother herself ended up driving me to events. And because she was not part of this network herself, she was not an aristocrat, she was not part of the elite that were involved in this club, but she wanted to be. But maybe because they knew of her mental illness, particular kind of mental illness was not safe for them, that she never really entered into, but she was paid to give me to this club. This club was led by the Minister of National Defense at the time, a man who was also Prime Minister of Belgium twice. So there were politicians, there were aristocrats who often offered their spaces, their castles. There were people who were lawyers and doctors that were involved, criminals. And then there were those who were trying to get in. That's to say, they were trying to climb that social ladder and get into this club. In the first years, I was considered expendable. That's to say, my life wasn't worth anything. I knew that there were aristocrats who killed children, and certain guests sometimes from other countries were also given children that could be killed, maybe for satanic rituals or because that is what they did. And when I was 9 years old, I was given to what I would call a global networker. That is to say, this was someone who was very powerful in the world, someone whose name is very easily recognizable by everyone. And then at the same time, had a very large role behind the scenes of world politics and world business. This person was a special guest in Belgium for the Bilderberg meeting in 1972. And even though the boss of the Belgian network was not part of the Bilderberg meeting, he had organized a satanic ritual in honor of this special guest. 2 children were offered. Myself, who was supposed to be sacrificed as a girl, and a young boy who was supposed to be raped. I was 9 years old. The boy was 7. This boy was a little bit special, and I felt extremely protective of him. I wanted to protect him because he was innocent. I may not have felt my own innocence, but I felt it in him. It was untouched. Now, this special guest considered this boy inferior to me because he was special, and therefore decided that the boy should be killed and he would rape me. My pleas to save my friend and to offer myself instead were treated like an annoyance, and completely ignored. I was raped while my little friend was butchered. And something happened there that I can only describe as a divine intervention, that after my friend died, this special guest ended up taking an interest in me. It would not have happened without some grace that passed through me, that made him see something in me which he thought was sophistication. Taking an interest, he decided then that he would train me, have me trained as his personal sex slave spy. And so for this purpose, I was taken to his homes in the United States, several of his homes there. And this man was very pleased that he could bring a child from another country who spoke a different language to any place where people would be so glad to serve him. And he could get away with that. And no one asked questions. On the contrary, everyone thought I was family or whatever. He didn't even have to explain anything most of the time. And I could see that he really enjoyed that. He was also training me now sexually, to make sure that none of the experiences that I would have sexually in these pleasant environments would be for myself. So he taught me to suppress my own sexual responses so that I could exist only for the sexual pleasure of the men. And he also taught me about good food, about art, and about generally good life, which included his love for nature and curated spaces. I was then sent to Germany for mind control training there. I think that the doctor there was closely connected to this global networker, and the doctor seemed to be working on this man's special projects, which I was one of them. In this mind control training, I was not sexually abused the entire time. I was trained to be a spy. I was trained to detect men's sexual preferences. I was trained to detect men's weaknesses. And these were done by being strapped, well, not strapped with metal chains to a chair, and my eyes pried open with metal clasps to watch films that showed first the face of a man and then the actions in which he engaged. And then I had to guess, based on just looking at a man's face and body, what they were either sexually into or what their weakness was. And if I got it wrong, I was drowned or suffocated in another way, and then driven to near-death experiences, which I was made to understand were also part of the training, because this opened my mind so that I would be able to more easily go from intuition straight to subconscious, from the subconscious straight to intuition, and bypassing the conscious mind. And I found myself noticing how effective this training was. There was no experimentation being done. This doctor and the 3 handlers that were working with me knew exactly what they were doing, and they seemed to also know exactly what the results would be. Another part of this training was that I should be able to kill, because as I was to spy on men for this global big shot, as I call him, global big shot, as I was to spy on men for him, that's to say he would sell me, which did happen soon after, to a man somewhere, a high-placed politician somewhere, and I would spend time with this politician. I'm sure that they paid him, but at the same time, I was to spy on them. That's to say, I had to guess what their weakness was, and then report that weakness to my owner, or I had to report to my owner what these men's sexual preferences were. That was just the beginning. There were plans for me that he was going to create a platform so that I would be a French sexy star, actor, singer, so that those most powerful men in the world would have an interest in me. And from that platform, I was to spy for him and belong to him. And this man really liked the idea of being in control behind the scenes and having created this creature that I was to become. And if something would go wrong, I would need to know how to kill. So I was trained to kill with a dagger. The first part of that training was I was actually chosen. I was given the choice to choose a puppy from a litter. And I thought it was a reward. So I had the puppy for 2 days. And then I was told I should kill him. And of course, I refused. So then this puppy was tortured in front of my eyes in the most horrendous way. So by the time I killed the puppy, it was a mercy killing. And that was the beginning of this training, that from then on, every killing is a mercy killing, because now I know what will happen if I refuse. The doctor who was in charge of this mind control program was also involved with abortion clinics. So I was made to train to kill on what were basically tiny babies, maybe aborted, I'm not sure, but very small, but alive. And then gradually bigger. A lot of killing. And then finally, I was also trained there to be psychic, and I was placed in a saltwater tank, sense deprivation tank. The salt water was too deep for me to fall asleep, or I would drown, or if I panicked, I would also drown. And it felt like I was in that tank for days. I had a task. So the first task was to report what I was feeling as people were mentally doing things to my body. And I did feel it, and I reported it. And in the second part, I was then brought out. It seemed like it was several days. The second part of this training, I was given a photo, and then I had to get into the mind of that man, and I had to insert myself into his consciousness and have him think about me and fall in love with me. And that was going to be my thing as this starlet in France, sexy starlet in France. I was supposed to have men fall in love with me, thinking I am their soulmate, so that they would reveal all their secrets to me quickly. Finally, I was inducted, and at age just before my 10th birthday, or just around my 10th birthday, I was going to be inducted, and there was to be an induction ceremony for me to enter into this cult. I was given a handler who was already a famous composer in France. I mean, I'm leaving things out. I was also trained to be a celebrity in a weird way, not by acting. But that ceremony, I saw many of the people who were very powerful at that time in 1972-3. And I, again, was shown what the price would be to belong to this club, which was to kill. And in this case, it was a child, a little, very little child who looked just like me, which I think was on purpose. I knew I could not do this. I did, but then I went against that my owner afterwards, and then I was quickly rejected, and ultimately I was pushed out of the Belgian network. I was rescued from out of the Belgian network as well, and given instructions how to live. So thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Anneke, and to Jean and Mary for sharing your truth, your fearlessness, honesty, and strength. I appreciate the courage and strength shown today by our speakers in sharing their experience, and you, the audience, for showing up. We'll now go into a short break and come back for part 2. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing about your experiences. We have about 7 minutes now for live Q&A, and I see that there have been some questions already in the Q&A, but feel free to take over, Donna, and facilitate this part.
Thanks, Rin. Hi, everyone. So we do have a question, and I'll really just open it up to who feels kind of called to answer this. But as a survivor who also took part in killing rituals and induced abortions and watching the murder of other children, naturally this person sharing that they feel overwhelmed with the grief and loss, including their own children taken from them. Really the question is around, can anyone share if you found a way out to help mourn and honour the children who didn't make it out?
I can answer a little bit of that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mary.
Just a little, that is an ongoing process for me, and it fuels a lot of my work in the world, like projects I'm working on, is this sense of wanting to be a spokesperson for those who cannot speak because their lives were taken so early. And I have a website now that, for example, that what gave me the courage and strength in a lot of ways was knowing that it may help stop this from continuing. And it was a process of mourning those lost as well. So.
Yeah, I can also quickly address that. I've done rituals even with other survivors where we've brought flowers and put the petals in the river and done our own rituals to basically think about and honor the souls of the children that didn't make it, both the children that we witnessed losing their lives and those that we didn't. And this is obviously something for my entire life is healing from the grief from those losses. And similarly to Mary, this is what motivates me.
Anneke, there's a question for you. And again, if you're not comfortable answering this, just let me know. But what were the instructions you received when you were rescued?
Yeah, that was very brief. So I wrote my, these instructions are part of the story that I wrote down in my memoir. The memoir is called Quest for Love, Memoir of a Child Sex Slave, and I'm the author. And basically, they did save my life. I was told to never become a prostitute, never sleep with anyone for sex, don't take drugs unless they were given to me, but never do anything to get them. Never leave the country, live in those cities. That's why I actually live in New York. It was very detailed directions about everything you can imagine, which really did. I followed, and of course also included never speak about the network, never say anything. But that is I did live by those instructions for many years until, of course, I started to be strong enough to break those rules. I was not told to go to therapy, and I was not going to get an education, but I did those things anyway.
Thank you. Jean, I might get you to answer this one. Is there a strong familial connection to the abuse? Do you think it's generational?
In my case, I'm sure it was generational. I also think that that if somebody comes into a satanic cult, they're not as securely, don't feel as safe to the other people as people who were born into it. Because of course, they've been controlled since they were infants or before. And somebody who's brought into a cult, who knows what you're getting. So I think many, many cults are generational.
Does anyone else want to share about that? Yeah, Mary, just unmute. Yeah.
I suspect my father was raised in an Irish cult, and he was largely split himself and was also taken advantage by the military because of that. They spotted his dissociative abilities in the army.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of questions that are focused on kind of healing, and so we might leave them to part 2, just for anyone that has asked that. I do want to acknowledge that. There's a couple of themes here around, outing abusers, justice, those kind of things, and the lack of accountability. Perhaps one of you could share about, I guess, your thoughts on the lack of accountability. How do you out these people? Maybe Anneke, you might want to share first.
Yes, I'll start speaking about that. So this question came up yesterday too, and then the word justice was used together with naming names. So I just first want to say that naming names does not lead to justice in this case, because when you name, when I or any one of us would name a very prominent abuser, that does not lead to justice. That would lead to a lot of attacks, possibly us being murdered. And it's not that any of us, I don't want to speak for anyone, but I think many of us I found that are willing to give our lives if it would be worth it, but we would be silently, done away with, like some people have. And so it's just about thinking on our toes. The tide is changing. I have named people. I'm always very careful when I name people. I started out by saying this is not about naming people. It's really about bringing awareness to this subject, which I think is more important, by the way, than naming the people. You should mistrust anyone who has an extremely large platform, who is extremely powerful. Let's just start by mistrusting those people and not believe that they're automatically believe that they are the great benefactors to the world that they are presented as. They have a huge PR machine behind them, and for good reasons. And it's mostly it's all lies that are being held up, mostly to cover the lie of this, what we're talking about. So this is a very big fight in that sense. I actually don't feel that I'm fighting, though. I don't feel like, there's maybe an epic battle going on, but I feel very supported, and I don't want to live in fear. I don't want to feel that I'm some like lone hero or anything like that. I just want to be careful when I speak out. That's my answer to that.